Nevertheless, we know that it's going to take a lot of money, a lot of capital and technology to help global South countries and complete this low carbon transition. And both China and the U.S. as the largest R&D spenders, the largest economies, and huge sources of FDI are going to be crucial players in that.
My name is Nitai Daitel, Senior Program Officer at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. I am pleased to introduce our guests for today's program, unpacking the implications of the downturn in U.S. China relations on multilateral climate cooperation. Briefly, as their full bios can be found on our website, Michael Davidson is an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Davidson's teaching and research focuses on the engineering implications and institutional conflicts inherent in deploying low-carbon energy at scale, specializing in China, India, and the United States. Before joining UCSD, he was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, a Fulbright fellow at Tsinghua University, and worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council. He is a fellow of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. Joanna Lewis is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University. She is also a faculty affiliate in the China Energy Group at the U.S. Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. She has worked for several governmental and non-governmental organizations and was a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the East-West Center. She, too, is a fellow of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. Moderating today's conversation will be Alex Wang, professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a leading expert on environmental law and the law and politics of China. His research focuses on the interaction of law and institutions in China and the United States. And prior to joining UCLA, Professor Wang was a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council based in Beijing and the founding director of NRDC's China Environmental Law and Governance Project. He, following a thread here, is also a fellow of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Nitai. And thanks to the National Committee for organizing this conversation about U.S. and China dynamics and climate change. It's a real pleasure to be talking with two old friends, Michael and Joanna, and who are among the leading experts on U.S.-China climate relations in the world. And it's I'm really pleased to have this chance to talk with you all and hear what you think on these topics. So why don't we just dive right in? I mean, I think the first question, you know, the so-called COP27, the International Climate Negotiation meetings, are coming up next week in Egypt. We all know that tensions between the U.S. and China are at their highest, the highest they've been in recent decades. We know that just in August, in response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, Beijing suspended official bilateral talks on climate action. And so right now, we enter the COP in this general state of affairs. And so I guess the first question I'd ask, and maybe ask Joanna to kick it off for us, is to comment on what you think these dynamics mean for the COP and what it means for Chinese and American climate action.
Yeah, well, I think it's, important to remember that it is, I think, in both China and the United States' interests to engage on climate change. Both countries' presidents want to be viewed as global leaders on this issue and see this issue as a domestic priority. So, I think, let me touch first on the importance of U.S.-China bilateral cooperation on climate change as pertains to the international climate negotiations, and then bring it back to COP27 specifically. It's important to remember, right, that we've seen engagement and coordination between China and the U.S. as key to really important progress being made in the multilateral climate sphere, right? So, of course, we point to the Paris Agreement in 2015. I think many of us believe that agreement would not exist today if we had not had concerted bilateral effort between the U.S. and China really led by then Secretary Kerry, going back to 2013, and really, you could point to decades of U.S. China engagement, but really, elevated in 2013 with the U.S. China Climate Change Working Group, and the 2014 joint statement between the U.S. and China, where their where their NDCs were announced a year ahead of Paris. I think that was really what led to, the world, building momentum around these targets, which led to the eventual adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And because the leadership of China and the US as the two largest emitters still, and sort of the figurehead leaders of the so-called developed and developing world, right? Just really important in the context of these negotiations. So, I think that, and then we saw this again in Glasgow, right? Just a year ago now, the dynamics very different from where we are today, but where just, in the final 48 hours of the meeting, we saw this surprise announcement of a U.S. China joint declaration, these back-to-back press conferences from Secretary Kerry, Minister Xie, that again announced this new joint statement, right? And then relaunched a U.S. China working group, and that's what got paused back in August.
Yeah. Well, before, if I could interject with a question, what's your take? I totally agree with you on the value of that cooperation pre-Paris. I felt that the Glasgow cooperation was felt less important, certainly because it didn't have the same impact, I think, as sort of the agreement leading into Paris. It's a question for maybe both of you. There is a debate about cooperation versus competition that we're going to sort of explore in this. And I'm curious as to whether you think, I would love your comments on the changing nature of cooperation. Do you think that type of cooperation is less important, or do you think it's as important as it ever was? Like the sort of joint announcements kind of showing that both the top emitters are on board with climate action.
Well, look, I would just say that, the joint declaration that was signed in Glasgow, that was the first time we'd had something like that since, back during the Obama administration, right? Because we essentially didn't have any real U.S. China engagement on climate during the Trump administration. So you were really, essentially starting from scratch and in a really different U.S. China climate, right? Now, U.S. China climate is not the right word, U.S. China relationship, a brand new set of economic and security tensions, right? Which we'll dive into. So I think that, the type of cooperation we were seeing during the Obama administration, which were about technology cooperation, things like the U.S. China Clean Energy Research Center, joint R&D, that is not happening in this current political climate for a variety of reasons, where we're really looking at strategic competition around clean energy technologies. And so I think it was still important, to have cooperation around things like methane emissions, again, things that were missing from China's NDC. So still significant, but I agree with you. It's a different type of cooperation, still important, to the momentum of the international negotiations. So, going into COP27, I do think it's problematic that, the lead negotiators, the heads of the delegations have not been in the same communication that they were going into other big COPs, but this is a lower stakes COP than Glasgow, than Paris. There's not a big global agreement on the table. There's not even a leader statement on the table, potentially. Yeah. This is really a COP with a different focus. And so I think, hopefully they won't sort of derail the focus of the negotiations, which is really much more on loss and damage, developing country issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd love to also ask both of you what do you expect to see out of the U.S. and China at the COPs, in particular in relation to each other? You've sort of already gestured at part of the exercise, maybe just trying to show leadership, right? That might be one of the goals. You've also noted that maybe hard to get this kind of technical cooperation that has been put, like, for example, from Glasgow out on the table. One of the things that seems to be coming out in the media coverage of China is China's been emphasizing common but differentiated responsibilities, this notion that developed nations have different responsibilities or more responsibilities than developing nations, and they've made a call for a global clean energy partnership with all of the different kind of global South organizations, ASEAN, BRICS, and others. And so they seem to be signaling that, maybe in the face of all of this kind of U.S. talk about competition, that they're trying to shore up their alliances. So I'm curious as to what, do you have any thoughts on that or other dynamics that you see might be part of the U.S. or Chinese strategy as they head into COP27?
Yeah, I think that certainly the cooperation dynamics have changed remarkably since the Obama administration, but also the need for cooperation has shifted. I think prior to Paris, there was a lot of uncertainty that we could get a consensus, unanimous, internationally agreed commitment like the Paris Agreement on the books that would push countries to make these commitments and then come back each year and on a regular schedule to update them. The need for cooperation between U.S. and China has shifted dramatically since then. Now, what I see is that we need to push both countries to stop getting in each other's ways of reducing emissions, putting up barriers and other policies that would make it harder to do the clean energy transition in both countries and in other countries. And notably, Alex, you mentioned these global South partnerships. If U.S.-China tensions get much worse and you start to see even higher costs and more difficulties with supply chains and more tensions, U.S. consumers are going to feel the pinch, but more likely in these other countries that are facing a very visceral choice based on affordability concerns about what energy choices to choose from, that's going to be most concerning. So I see any kind of partnerships that U.S. and China want to make with other developing countries to try to help them on the low carbon transition as a boon for the climate. I would like to see a little bit less of a zero-sum competition between U.S. and China on securing those partnerships. I think there is still space to work together on these, despite the way the current tensions are. But nevertheless, we know that it's going to take a lot of money, a lot of capital and technology to help global South countries and complete this low carbon transition. And both China and the U.S. as the largest R&D spenders, the largest economies, and huge sources of FDI are going to be crucial players in that.
I mean, I just think it's really amazing if you think back to where we were a year ago versus where we are now and just how the world has changed on this issue. I mean, remember back in fall of 2021 when President Xi had made this announcement at UNGA about how China was going to stop financing coal plants abroad, right? And this really, everyone was very excited about this. And there were all these commitments being made in the G7 and elsewhere about how everyone was going to stop building coal and really, going into COP 26, there was just all this momentum about the phase down of fossil fuels and moving away from coal, right? And now here we are a year later with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and everyone is scrambling for more fossil fuels, and you're seeing just this backsliding, right, on a lot of the commitments that were made across Europe. You're seeing, Germany really, I think, really trying to get out of a lot of the commitments that were made. And you see the developing world looking at this, right? And this is going to come out, I think, very strongly at COP27, which is on the African continent, right? And there's just going to be this focus on what is going on, why are we sort of pulling back on a lot of these commitments? What is the role, right, of a lot of these financing pledges? And, and I think this is just really about, how the commitments that have been made, what did they mean? How can we make sure that there's going to be follow through, right? And then, of course, China's at the center of a lot of this.
That's such a great point. And I think, we are, the sense that you're getting these days is also just that climate impacts are so much more on the forefront of everyone's mind, right? It's in the headlines every day. I think media coverage has really started to change and report, I think, in a more substantial and better way about just the the climate impacts that we're facing every day. And so that's the context within which this discussion will be happening. Now, on this, I want to come back to a point that Michael was making. You're essentially gesturing at this possibility of sort of in this competition doing harm to our ability to pursue climate action. So maybe I want to ask a question to both of you about, clearly this notion of competition is out there and has become central to the Biden administration's China strategy, right? They've put out this notion, the pithy phrasing of it, I believe, is invest and align and compete, right? So just, invest at home, ally with people, and then compete on that basis. So what do you all think about the prospects of that actually driving positive change in the sort of space race analogy versus going south in a way that does more harm than good, right? Arguably, Inflation Reduction Act is a really positive sign, in the invest category from the United States, right? It's a big move, and we're all excited to see how that plays out. But we've all sort of been thinking about this issue of how it can accelerate in a positive direction versus go in a negative slowdown direction. I'm curious as to your thoughts on this dynamic.
I'll take a stab at it. I think there's, of course, elements, positive elements and negative elements in the new framing, right? We know that the costs of clean energy have come down quite a bit due to very stiff global competition, and they need to go down even further, and competition is going to help with that. We know that we need a lot of technologies that we don't have commercially available today. That's not going to come just from governments making R&D investments. It's going to come from private sector. It's motivated by competition, competitive firms accessing capital resources globally. So we know that we need all of those elements. The challenge is that if you take a competitive stance and you insist on a more national competitiveness angle, then you might put up barriers to enable the lowest cost technology and the best innovations to diffuse. And we do see elements of those as well, where you have an increasing turn towards protectionism, which would make the whole process of developing and deploying low carbon technologies that much harder, not just for US and China, but for the rest of the world.
Yeah. And, we the three of us were recent co-authors on a piece that came out in Science Policy Forum, kind of in part getting at this issue of the risks of decoupling. I don't know if either of you want to comment a little bit more about, the tagline on that was, sometimes the medicine is worse than the cure is worse than the disease, I think. So I don't know if you guys want to talk about that. The paper basically unpacks economic and security risks associated with decoupling or integration.
Yeah, I mean, we were motivated by the policy debates that are occurring in the US and Europe and elsewhere around decoupling from China that really lack specificity and an objective assessment of the risks and benefits of that policy direction. And so our methodology was we selected 5 technologies, emerging and mature. We went through, we focused on economic and national security risks, as you mentioned. We tried to score across each of the technologies, these different metrics, went down to the component level, and then we aggregated those up to each technology. And we came up with some subjective assessments, and our kind of broad conclusions are that economic risks are much more heterogeneous than national security risks. Some economic risks include the risk of supply chain disruptions, and for those, policy recourse strategy might be a selective process of diversification. On the other hand, national security risks are much more homogeneous and seem to be quite muted across these technologies, which seem to indicate that we should be focusing less on justifying using national security angles, the decoupling agenda, particularly in low carbon technology from China. I mean, we also conclude, and this is based on work by Joanna and others, that government facilitation is desirable to pursue joint demonstrations for new technologies, and that there's a need for diversification in different technology pathways that both US and China, again, as the world's two largest R&D superpowers in clean energy and in many other areas need to take the lead on.
And so, yeah, Joanna, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that this is, we've seen this real shift in how Washington is thinking about climate policy, right? Where, when I came here almost 20 years ago now, right, we were really thinking about market-based responses, right? How we can get a cap and trade bill through Congress and all this, right? And we really shifted to an industrial policy strategy, right? And when you look at the IRA, it's a green industrial policy. It's really about thinking about how we can build clean energy industries here at home, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But we really need to be, I think, we need to be frank about the trade-offs about doing that, and what, how that could actually slow down our ability to deploy low carbon technologies at scale, not just here in the United States, but globally, particularly in the developing world. Because when you look at global climate targets, when you look at where, clean energy technologies need to be deployed, to meet 1.5 degree goals, right? But by the end of the century, it's mostly in the developing world. These are places that are, where you need these technologies to be as inexpensive as possible, right? And Michael very nicely documented with some colleagues in a recent Nature paper, the role that China there's played in just driving down the costs of solar and other technologies, right, to make them more affordable for the world, right, in solving the climate crisis. So when you start to decouple from China, which is now, like it or not, just has the dominant, is just dominant in these clean energy supply chains, right, is just dominant in batteries, dominant in wind, dominant in solar. We have to be just very clear about the cost repercussions of that, right? And the security issues are, as we evaluate in the science paper, are relatively minimal, often managed, right? And so it's just not a sort of one size fits all solution. And so we're just sort of asking for a nuanced approach and a strategic approach to sort of how we handle this, and being conscious of sort of what are the climate trade-offs versus the sort of economic and security trade-offs.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it, I think, to think that there are climate trade-offs for this move, which is already beginning, right? So America is engaging in industrial policy, and the hope is either to reshore manufacturing or to so-called friendshore, right? Get it into friendly countries. And one question is that realistic? Right. I'm curious as to where you all stand right now. And part of the answer may just be it's hard to know. We need to do a lot more research. We probably need more investment in these types of things. But I'm curious as to where you all stand on that, because it's not obvious that this will succeed, right? There's plenty of risk in this endeavor. Right.
I mean, I'm doing some research on this topic now, right? And I mean, it's difficult. And when you look at, the non-China countries that are involved in these supply chains, and first of all, a lot of the non-Chinese countries are actually Chinese-owned facilities, right? Who have, for the most part, due to trade restrictions, sort of built,
they've shifted their plants,
they've shifted supply chains to Southeast Asia and elsewhere, right? So they're technically still Chinese. But you basically see, if your goal is to sort of diversify to, friendlier markets, you're basically, there's a handful of countries that are well positioned. It's primarily in East Asia, Japan, South Korea. If your goal is to sort of, try to help other developing countries sort of build capacity, that is a difficult thing, in countries where you don't necessarily have the capacity to kind of build up these industries. And you find that, like particularly in Africa, South America, the main parts of the supply chain that are there are the extractive industries. It's the mining, of rare earths, for example. Which are, these are dirty extractive industries. And that's sort of the only thing you see kind of, outside of China. And there's other issues, right, with sort of building up those industries. in these parts of the world. And these are often not necessarily things like the US wants to reshore, right? They're looking more for the kind of the higher value added refining, sort of parts of the industry. So I think it's complex. And I think, and honestly, like in the research we're doing to kind of characterize where the non-China supply chains are and, what this would look like the data is not great, right? It's, and so I think this has to be carefully thought through.
Right. In the environmental law area, there's a lot of discussion kind of bubbling up now about permitting issues. How do you speed up deployment while still being true to the environmental guardrails and conflicts between different environmental issues. So this is going to be a really contested area.
Yeah, very important.
Years. I know, Michael, do you have a comment? I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Just basic point on this. The basic endeavor to kind of reshore or friendshore. Where are you now on the risks and the likelihood of a success in that area?
Yeah, I think one of the contributions of our science paper is really to distinguish between a domestic only onshore strategy, which is sometimes seen as being the only response to concentration in China, and a diversification strategy. Diversification doesn't mean we bring it all home. It means that we have some diversification across multiple countries in case of supply chain disruptions, for example, which can occur due to natural disasters as much as government intervention or threats of trade embargoes or something like that.
Or a pandemic.
Or a pandemic, right? The pandemic, of course, is pandemic, it's global, but it can have localized impacts. But more specific natural disasters like the Fukushima tsunami and the impacts that had on Japan's supply chains, those kinds of things, of course, merit some consideration. That's a diversification that calls for diversification, and there's a higher bar if we want to have fully domestic onshore for the reason to mitigate those risks. But I will say the Inflation Reduction Act, since we're kind of talking about this quite a bit, which was passed over the summer, is the first major piece of climate legislation, ever by some counts, compared to the last big legislation, the Recovery Act. This is a huge increase, up from roughly 90 billion in the Recovery Act, which was passed after the 2008 financial crisis, up to 370 billion in climate and environmental investments, and had an explicit climate focus. And this is overwhelmingly good and includes many industrial policy elements that Joanna talked about. So specifically predictable long-term credits for renewable energy, as well as other newer technologies like carbon capture. It has manufacturing subsidies. These are all elements that contributed to China's success in its own clean tech supply chains, for example, as well as consumer-facing rebates and many other elements that are all very good. Now, but they do present some challenges for U.S.-China relations. One is that they don't do anything with the existing or prospective trade remedies that are in place that are currently making technologies imported in the U.S. more expensive, making it more expensive for U.S. consumers to deploy those technologies, and likely slowing down learning processes, as we talked about in a separate paper. And nothing encapsulates this point more than a huge kerfuffle that we had in May, where the Department of Commerce was considering. It took a trade case that was considering slapping tariffs of up to 200% or more on imported panels, not from China, but from other countries, Southeast Asia, like Joanna mentioned, that basically ground the entire solar industry to a halt. You had 70 gigawatts of deployment at risk, 100,000 jobs, according to the Solar Energy Industry Association, that were at risk because of how far some of these trade remedies could be taken. And, legitimate reasons on their part that the administration might actually go that far. Now, the Biden administration had to step in to say, no, wait a minute, we're not going to put those enormous tariffs on it. And they put a 2-year pause on it. And that was enough to kind of quiet down the industry and get things rolling again. But that was a Band-Aid fix for a much more systemic problem. And I think this challenge of how do we and to what extent do we onshore all of the clean tech manufacturing supply chain is with us for some time. And so my kind of short response to that, Alex, is I don't think it's realistic to have a completely onshore keep it, seal it off within our borders, domestic supply chain for all the things that we're going to need to combat climate change. I do think there is an important role for U.S. manufacturing and for other U.S. parts of the value chain, as we see in other technologies like wind, where Joanna has done a lot of work on. But I think it's really important for us to think about what kinds of policies can we do to support the manufacturing employment and support the other policy objectives that we have, while also not stomping on global supply chains and global learning, which has got us to the point now where we can actually envision and visualize 100% clean energy system.
Great. I want to shift gears to the question of how China is doing on meeting its own climate goals. So as I think most people will know, China has a 2060 carbon neutrality goal and a goal to peak before 2030, peak emissions before 2030. And so I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on how that's going these days, right? We've heard a lot about the China's construction of coal-fired power plants, even as they're building out a lot of clean tech. And then I want to ask you for a specific, if you were to be able to implement right now one major policy change to help this movement on climate action along, what would you pick?
So the broadly is, what is China doing on climate recently, and what are the challenges that it's facing? Well, the similar challenges that are faced by other countries is energy security, right? That's top of mind for China's planners, European planners, American planners, everybody. And that's recognizing that energy systems serve multiple policy objectives, and climate and environment come along a little late to this, but energy security and affordability are always top of mind. And so China had this very massive power outage in 2021 and had some more localized power outages again in 2022. And those are driven in part by this volatility with global fossil fuel markets, but also driven by incomplete reforms in China to its power system and power markets. And the much more focused response to that has reached the highest levels, where we saw President Xi Jinping and outgoing Premier Li Keqiang talk about this issue, energy security, much more prominent than what you saw before. Unfortunately, they're also taking some of the wrong lessons, where they're doubling down on coal power deployment in certain areas, thinking that this was because there wasn't enough coal power capacity to provide demand, which is not the case. China actually has a very diverse set of renewable energy resources geographically, and has the envy of the world's largest ultra-high voltage transmission network, where it can transmit that power across large distances. So when the sun is shining out west, folks in the east can take advantage of it, et cetera. So I think China's lessons, and what I would sort of recommend to help address these energy security concerns while also staying on the low carbon path, is to diversify more, to diversify across renewable and nuclear energy sources, which are much less susceptible to global volatility in fossil fuel markets, and to double down on reforms to power markets and transmission operation that can allow that energy to get to market in an efficient, cost-effective way.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you threw in a wonkier grid reform recommendation. I was almost afraid you weren't going to bring that in. So, Joanna, what do you think?
Yeah, I knew he would, which is why I wanted him to go first. I mean, I think that, Michael and others have just done really important work on, pointing out that the challenges to China's, decarbonization are, at this point, they're really not technical. It's really the political economy of China's power sector transition right now that are really holding up a lot of what should be happening there. I mean, when you see these just really distorted incentives behind building new coal plants, right? And again, yes, energy security, right? But it's not a shortage. It's not a real shortage, right? In that it's not a supply demand imbalance. It is, but it's an artificial one, right? And it's due to these bottlenecks in the grid, and the way that the grid is structured, and the way that power is moved around the country, and the way that these markets are set up, that they're not real markets, and who has control, right, over these things, and the way things are priced. And again, a lot of it is just the fact that you are just sort of trying to operate, You're trying to sort of introduce market signals in what is primarily still operating as a non-market economy, with very powerful interests, right? Primarily state-owned enterprises and primarily the coal industry and the large power companies. And so you just have this issue where you do have, increasingly large amounts of clean energy that is still, it's being integrated in the grid at much larger amounts than it used to be. We do see decreasing curtailment numbers, but you just have these real inefficiencies in the way coal plants are being operated, which is very low capacity factors. And you just have this just really inefficiency in the way power is still being priced, right? And just being operated in the grid, even though you have this super high tech, as Michael mentioned, ultra high voltage transmission, and there's just sort of no technical basis for a lot of these. I think are really just political inefficiencies.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you see these political skirmishes being fought in so many different areas, right? Like, for example, I recently spent a year working with Chinese partners on the emissions trading system.
Yes.
And for those who don't follow this, in essence, the system turns out to be, it's a system that subsidizes more efficient coal-fired power plants and taxes less efficient coal-fired power plants. And there's ways that lots of people are proposing different ways that you could make it more, create more dramatic incentives, for example, for clean energy. Like you could build it in so that if you built more clean energy, you would benefit from the subsidies of the system. But just the way the politics of that has played out, it's really turned into a way to kind of edge the coal fleet in a more efficient direction rather than something more dramatic.
And again, that system was originally designed to cover 8 sectors, right, including the heavy industrial sectors, which are still the vast majority of China's energy consumption, right? But they're not yet, right? Part of that, it's still starting with the power sector, right? So there's again, a lot of what China has to do on emissions is still about it's about heavy industry. And again, a lot of this is responding to economic stimulus measures and what's happening kind of in the zero COVID, sort of what's happening there. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're about at time, so it's always great to hear your thoughts on everything, and thanks again to the National Committee for having us here to discuss these important issues, and hand it back to Nitai.
Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who helped me make today's interview possible. We hope that those who have tuned in today found the interview both interesting and informative, and that you will join us for future National Committee programming down the road. Thank you all again, and have a great day.